The November rain pounded against the windshield of Captain Michael Sullivan's pickup truck as he sat frozen in the parking lot of Fort Carson Military Base. Through sheets of rain, his eyes locked onto a sight that made his heart stop. A German shepherd stood at attention beside a uniformed handler near the entrance to the Veterans Resource Center, its posture unmistakably military despite the gray now coloring its muzzle. Even from this distance, Michael could see the distinctive scar that ran across the dog's right flank, a wound he had bandaged himself a decade ago during their final mission together. "Shadow," he whispered, the name catching in his throat. After 10 long years of searching, of endless phone calls and emails to military contacts gone cold, of his son Tyler's drawings of the dog he barely remembered but never stopped missing. It seemed impossible. Michael's hands trembled on the steering wheel as memories flooded back. The explosion, the confusion, the medical evacuation that separated them. The promises from military officials that Shadow would be returned once he recovered from his injuries. Promises that faded into bureaucratic silence as weeks turned to months, and months to years. Without conscious thought, Michael pushed open his truck door, the cold rain instantly soaking through his civilian clothes. His military bearing, 20 years as an Army Ranger before his medical retirement, momentarily abandoned him as emotion took control. The prosthetic leg that had replaced his left limb felt suddenly heavy as he moved across the parking lot, eyes never leaving the German shepherd. "Shadow!" he called out, his commanding voice carrying across the distance despite the downpour. The reaction was electric. The German shepherd's head snapped around, ears forward, body rigid with attention. For a heartbeat, time suspended between them. Then Shadow lunged forward with such force that his handler nearly lost his grip on the leash. The dog's behavior was unmistakable. The precise combination of discipline and desperate recognition that Michael had experienced countless times during their 4 deployments together. Though a decade had passed, the connection between handler and military working dog remained unbroken. Before they could reach each other, 3 uniformed military police vehicles converged on the scene. Lights flashing through the rain. Major Rebecca Winters stepped out of the lead vehicle, her expression grim beneath her rain-spattered cap. "Captain Sullivan, stand down immediately," she ordered, her voice amplified by a handheld speaker. "That animal is classified military property assigned to the K9 Veteran Therapy Program. Your approach is unauthorized and in violation of Code 47B of Military Working Dog Protocols." Michael planted his feet firmly on the wet pavement, the rain now streaming down his face. "That's Shadow, my Shadow. We served together in Afghanistan and Iraq. He saved my life at Korangal Valley. Check his microchip, number 45587 ARC. Sir, this dog's designation is Sentinel. He's been with our rehabilitation program for 6 years, following specialized retraining," Major Winters replied, her professional demeanor faltering slightly as she took in Michael's certainty. "I understand the resemblance might be striking, but he has 3 healed bullet wounds from our 3rd tour," Michael interrupted, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Left shoulder, right hip, and a graze along his muzzle. And he has a specific reaction to the command silent watch that isn't in any training manual." Major Winters exchanged a glance with the dog's handler, who was struggling to keep the German shepherd from pulling toward Michael. The animal's behavior clearly contradicted their assertion. Behind them, the doors to the resource center opened as a group of veterans emerged, curious about the commotion. Among them was Colonel James Blackwood, recently appointed director of Veteran Affairs for the Mountain Division, and Michael's former commanding officer. His eyes widened as he recognized the tableau unfolding in the rain. "Sullivan," he called, making his way toward them with the assistance of a cane. "What in God's name?" From across the parking lot, a black government SUV pulled in, its tires sending up sprays of water. Two men in dark suits emerged, their expressions stern as they surveyed the scene. One immediately pulled out a phone, while the other approached with purposeful strides. "This situation is now under jurisdiction of the Defense Department's advanced K9 unit," the man announced, flashing credentials briefly. "This animal is part of a specialized program with classified status. Everyone needs to disperse immediately." But Michael remained unmoved, his eyes never leaving Shadow, who continued straining against his handler's grip, emitting a high-pitched whine that Michael recognized as the dog's response to extreme stress or separation. The gathering of veterans, recognizing the significance of the moment, began to form a loose semicircle behind Michael. Among them were men and women who understood the sacred bond formed between handlers and their military working dogs. Those who had witnessed firsthand how these partnerships saved countless lives on battlefields around the world. Through the heavy downpour, a small figure suddenly appeared, running from a parked car toward the standoff. Tyler Sullivan, now 14 years old, had been waiting in the truck when he spotted his father's confrontation. The boy who had been just 4 when Shadow disappeared, who had grown up surrounded by photos of his father and the German Shepherd, in desert camouflage, who had never stopped asking when Shadow would come home. "Dad!" he called out, slipping slightly on the wet pavement as he approached. Is that really him?" At the sound of the boy's voice, Shadow's behavior changed. His frantic pulling calmed, head tilting in a gesture of recognition so profound, it silenced everyone present. Something in the teenager's voice, some echo of the child he had once protected, registered in the dog's memory. The government agent stepped forward, positioning himself between Michael and the dog. "Captain Sullivan, this animal has been repurposed for a federal program that assists veterans with PTSD. Your interference is disrupting vital therapeutic work and potentially triggering the animal's combat conditioning." The rain intensified, thunder rumbling in the distance as dark clouds gathered overhead. Colonel Blackwood moved to stand beside Michael, his military authority evident despite his retirement. "Agent," he said calmly, "I've known this man and that dog for 15 years. If he says that's Shadow, I'm inclined to believe him." "With all due respect, Colonel, you don't have clearance for the information regarding this animal's current assignment," the agent replied, his expression unyielding. "This situation requires immediate de-escalation." Dr. Elaine Matthews, the VA's chief psychologist who had been working with Michael's PTSD support group, approached cautiously, her clinical objectivity temporarily set aside as she observed the German Shepherd's behavior. "I've never seen a reaction like this," she said quietly to Major Winters. "This goes beyond standard recognition patterns." The stage was set for a confrontation that would unravel a decade of secrets, challenging the boundaries between military protocol and the unbreakable bond forged in combat. A connection that somehow had survived 10 years of separation, bureaucratic barriers, and whatever mysterious program had claimed Shadow as their own. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. In the quiet mountain town of Silver Creek, Colorado, Captain Michael Sullivan had once embodied the warrior ethos that defined America's finest soldiers. Before the rain-soaked confrontation at Fort Carson, Michael had lived a life of disciplined routine, a shadow of the decorated Army Ranger who had led elite teams through the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan and Iraq. His modest ranch house on the outskirts of town stood as testament to his preference for solitude, its meticulously maintained yard and precisely arranged interior reflecting the military precision that still governed his civilian life. At 42, Michael's physical presence commanded respect. The slight silver at his temples and the deep lines etched around his eyes spoke of experiences few civilians could comprehend. He moved with deliberate efficiency, despite the prosthetic leg that had replaced his left limb below the knee. A permanent reminder of the IED explosion that had ended his military career and separated him from Shadow 10 years earlier. His neighbors described him as intensely private but unfailingly helpful, the kind of man who would spend hours clearing an elderly couple's driveway after a snowstorm without ever mentioning it. Tyler, his 14-year-old son, was the center of Michael's world. After losing his wife Andrea to cancer 3 years after his medical discharge, Michael had devoted himself entirely to raising their boy. The transition to single parenthood, while battling his own demons, had tested him more severely than any military campaign. The photograph on his bedside table told the story. Michael in desert camouflage, kneeling beside Shadow, with 4-year-old Tyler sitting between them during a rare family day before his final deployment. It was the last time they had all been together. Michael's military service had been exceptional by any standard. 20 years in uniform, 14 of them as an Army Ranger, with commendations that included 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a Purple Heart. His personnel file, portions of which remained classified, detailed operations across 3 continents and specialized training in advanced combat tactics. What stood out most, however, was his remarkable record as a K9 handler, specifically his partnership with Shadow. Their partnership began as standard military procedure, but evolved into something the Army's K9 training division studied as a benchmark for handler dog efficiency. Shadow wasn't just any military working dog, he was what veteran handlers called a once-in-a-generation animal. His ability to detect explosives exceeded testing protocols, his protection instincts were unmatched, and his intelligence allowed him to adapt to changing battlefield conditions with almost human comprehension. In official military records, Shadow's designation read MWD 7789S, Specialized Detection and Protection Asset, but to the men of Michael's unit, he was simply the Guardian. Records documented 17 confirmed instances where Shadow had detected IEDs before they could be triggered, saving dozens of American and Allied lives. 3 times he had directly engaged enemy combatants who had ambushed the unit, sustaining injuries that would have ended the career of a less determined animal. But it was Shadow's behavior around Tyler during their brief time together that revealed his extraordinary character. Despite his intensive combat training, the German Shepherd displayed remarkable gentleness with the then toddler, positioning himself protectively nearby during family video calls and remaining vigilant whenever the child was present. This duel, nature, fierce protector in combat and gentle guardian with family, made Shadow irreplaceable. The night everything changed remained seared in Michael's memory with painful clarity. During a night operation in the Koringal Valley, their unit had been ambushed. Shadow had detected the threat seconds before it materialized, giving Michael just enough time to alert his team. In the ensuing firefight, both Michael and Shadow sustained serious injuries when an IED detonated nearby. Military records documented their medical evacuation under heavy fire, noting Shadow's refusal to leave Michael's side, despite his own wounds, until sedated by medics. What happened after that remained murky. Michael awoke in a military hospital in Germany to learn that his leg had been amputated below the knee. When he asked about Shadow, he was initially told the dog was recovering at a specialized veterinary facility. Weeks passed, and the answers became increasingly vague. By the time Michael returned to US soil, Shadow had been classified as reassigned under special directive, with access to information restricted even from his handler. For 10 years, Michael had navigated military bureaucracy searching for answers. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests, contacted former commanders, and networked with veteran K9 handlers. The responses formed a pattern of bureaucratic obstruction. Shadow had been recategorized under a specialized program. His status was classified. Inquiries were being processed. With each passing year, the trail grew colder. Dr. Elaine Matthews, the VA psychologist who had been working with Michael for the past 18 months, documented the profound impact of this unresolved loss. In her clinical notes, she wrote, "Patient exhibits classic symptoms of compound trauma, combat-related PTSD, complicated by unresolved grief over the separation from his military working dog, which patient describes as losing my right arm after already losing my left leg." Therapeutic progress remains limited by his fixation on locating Shadow, which has become both a coping mechanism and an obstacle to acceptance. Colonel James Blackwood represented one of the few connections to Michael's military past who hadn't abandoned him to bureaucratic limbo. Now serving as regional director for veteran affairs, Blackwood had maintained occasional contact, providing what limited information he could access about Shadow without violating security protocols. His own distinguished career and current position lent credibility to Michael's search, though even his influence had proven insufficient to penetrate the classified program that had claimed Shadow. The depth of Michael's bond with Shadow was perhaps best illustrated by Tyler's unwavering belief in their reunion. Despite having been only 4 years old when Shadow disappeared, Tyler had grown up surrounded by stories and photographs of the German Shepherd who had once been his protector. Michael's determination to find Shadow had shaped his son's understanding of loyalty and persistence. Tyler's bedroom wall featured a detailed timeline he had created, mapping every lead and contact in their search, a child's attempt to make sense of a loss that defied explanation. The Sullivan home contained subtle reminders of Shadow's continued presence in their lives. A worn leather collar hung beside Michael's service medals in a display case. The backyard featured a specially built dog run that had never been used but was meticulously maintained. Each Christmas, Tyler added a new German Shepherd ornament to their tree, marking another year of waiting. These rituals of remembrance had become so ingrained in their family life that visitors often commented it felt as though the dog might walk through the door at any moment. In Silver Creek, Michael had developed a reputation for helping local veterans navigate the complexities of the VA system, putting his own frustrating experience to use for others. The weekly support group he reluctantly joined at Dr. Matthews' insistence had eventually become a community for those struggling with the aftermath of service. Though Michael rarely spoke of Shadow during these meetings, the other veterans understood the significance of what had been taken from him. Not just a military asset, but a brother in arms who had shared the worst moments of war and the difficult transition home. When he closed his eyes at night, Michael could still feel Shadow's solid presence beside him. The way the dog would position himself between the Dugor and Michael's cot in whatever temporary shelter they occupied during deployment. The phantom sensation was so vivid that more than once he had reached down in the darkness, expecting to feel the coarse fur beneath his fingertips. These moments, more than the physical pain of his injuries, marked the true cost of his service. A bond severed not by death, but by an institutional decision that treated Shadow as equipment rather than the extraordinary being Michael knew him to be. Shadow wasn't just assigned to Michael Sullivan. He was specifically selected after an extraordinary display of aptitude that caught the attention of the Advanced Canine Training Division. Born into the elite military working dog breeding program at Lackland Air Force Base, Shadow had shown remarkable intelligence from his earliest evaluations. His official designation, MWD 7789S, appeared in military records alongside assessment scores that broke previous benchmarks in scent detection, situational awareness, and adaptive problem solving. The first time Michael met Shadow at the K9 training facility in Fort Benning, the connection was immediate and unexpected. Master Sergeant Jeffries, who had overseen the dog's initial training, later documented the encounter. Have never witnessed such immediate synchronization between handler and animal. Sullivan and Subject S demonstrated communication patterns typically observed only after months of intensive training. Recommend immediate pairing for specialized deployment preparation. Their first 6 months of training together revealed capabilities that exceeded standard protocols. Shadow demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate Michael's commands, often responding to subtle shifts in his handler's breathing and posture before verbal cues were given. The training officers documented Shadow's problem-solving abilities with particular interest, noting how the German Shepherd would independently identify alternative routes during obstacle courses when primary paths were blocked, a level of initiative rarely seen in even the most advanced working dogs. What made Shadow truly exceptional, however, was his ability to modulate his behavior based on environmental context. In simulated combat scenarios, he transformed into a precise military asset, focused, aggressive when commanded, and unflinchingly protective. Yet when training exercises ended, Shadow displayed a gentleness and social awareness that contradicted conventional understanding of high-drive military dogs. This adaptive intelligence became the foundation of their unprecedented effectiveness. In the field, their first deployment to Afghanistan in 2008 tested their partnership under the harshest conditions imaginable. During a routine patrol outside Kandahar, Shadow alerted to an IED hidden in an abandoned vehicle, a device so sophisticated it had evaded electronic detection equipment. His precise indication allowed the EOD team to neutralize the threat, saving the 16 men in their convoy. This incident, the first of many similar interventions, earned Shadow the informal title the Ghost Finder among the unit. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who served alongside them during that tour, described their communication in his field journal. Sullivan and Shadow operate like a single organism, have watched them clear buildings with a synchronicity that seems almost supernatural. Dog anticipates threats before they materialize. Handler trusts dog's judgment implicitly. Never seen anything like it in 20 years of service. The bond deepened through shared trauma. During an ambush near the Pakistan border, Michael and Shadow were separated from their unit for 72 hours. Military records documented their eventual recovery with clinical detachment. Handler and Canine. Assets successfully evaded enemy forces and returned to forward operating base with actionable intelligence. What the official report didn't capture was how Shadow had hunted small game to bring back to an injured Michael, how he had maintained silent watch through freezing mountain nights, or how he had guided them back through hostile territory with an almost compass-like precision. After returning from that deployment, Shadow's behavioral assessment noted significant changes. Subject demonstrates heightened attachment to Handler, displaying stress markers when separated, even for routine. Procedures. Recommend maintain proximity during inter-deployment period to preserve operational effectiveness. The military psychologist who reviewed the report recognized what was happening. The bond had transcended training to become something rarely acknowledged in official documents, a profound partnership based on mutual trust and dependence. This connection was most evident in how they navigated trauma together. Following a particularly devastating operation where their unit lost 3 men to a suicide bomber, both Michael and Shadow exhibited symptoms of acute stress. Training officers observed how they stabilized each other. Shadow would position himself against Michael during episodes of hypervigilance, providing deep pressure therapy without specific training in this technique. Michael, in turn, would maintain physical contact with Shadow during thunderstorms that triggered the dog's combat-associated stress responses. The most remarkable dimension of their bond emerged unexpectedly during Michael's brief family visits. Shadow, who had been trained to view civilians with calculated vigilance, displayed an entirely different behavioral pattern around Michael's young son, Tyler. Military canine handlers typically keep strict separation between their working dogs and family members, but Shadow's discernment defied conventional practices. During their first introduction at a controlled family day event, training officers were prepared to intervene if necessary. Instead, they witnessed something extraordinary. 4-year-old Tyler, initially hesitant around the large German Shepherd, had dropped his favorite toy, a small stuffed dinosaur. Before anyone could react, Shadow carefully retrieved it, dropped it gently at the boy's feet, and backed away to a respectful distance. This interaction initiated a remarkable relationship. Video recordings from subsequent visits show Shadow consistently positioning himself between the child and the door, maintaining what canine behavioral specialists identified as a protective formation while displaying none of the tension typically associated with his security posture. Dr. Teresa Langford, the military's lead canine behaviorist who reviewed these interactions, noted, "Subject exhibits discrimination abilities beyond standard training parameters, clearly differentiating between the handler's child and other civilians. This suggests cognitive processing closer to contextual reasoning than conditioned response. Recommend further study of this exceptional human-canine bond." The most telling demonstration of their connection came during their third deployment. While clearing a suspected Taliban compound, Shadow suddenly changed direction against his training, physically pulling Michael away from their planned route. Seconds later, A hidden shooter opened fire on the position they would have occupied. In his after-action report, Michael detailed how Shadow had detected not just the presence of a threat, but had anticipated the tactical situation and responded with what could only be described as strategic thinking. Staff Sergeant Martinez, who witnessed the incident, reported, "If I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it. That wasn't standard K9 behavior. Dog didn't just alert. He made a tactical decision that saved Sullivan's life. Whatever they've got between them goes beyond any training program I've encountered in 15 years of special operations." Their effectiveness in combat operations attracted attention beyond their immediate command structure. Shadow's detection statistics exceeded all established metrics, with confirmed findings of advanced IEDs that eluded both electronic countermeasures and other working dogs. Their joint combat record included successful operations across 3 provinces, with 27 documented instances where their interventions prevented American casualties. The classified nature of many of their missions meant that only fragments appeared in official records, but the pattern was clear. Whenever conventional approaches failed, Michael and Shadow were deployed. Their reputation for accomplishing the impossible became so established that special operations planners would specifically request them for the most sensitive missions, often bypassing standard assignment protocols to secure their participation. Beyond the operational statistics lay the daily reality of their bond, the thousands of small moments that defined their partnership. Shadow sleeping pressed against Michael's cot during rare moments of rest, always positioned between his handler and the door. Michael adjusting his patrol route based on subtle changes in Shadow's ear position or breathing pattern, trusting the dog's senses over intelligence briefings. The specialized hand signals they developed that weren't in any training manual, allowing them to communicate silently across distances that exceeded standard operational parameters. The depth of their connection was perhaps best captured in the journal Michael kept during their deployments, a document later submitted as evidence in his quest to locate Shadow. People talk about dogs being loyal, but that doesn't begin to describe what happens in combat. Shadow doesn't serve with me because of training or rewards or obligation. We've moved beyond handler and working dog. We've seen the worst humanity has to offer together, saved each other more times than I can count. The military can call him equipment on paper, but the truth is we became parts of the same whole out here. There's no word for what we are to each other. This extraordinary partnership made their sudden separation all the more devastating. The medical evacuation that took place after the IED explosion near Korangal Valley should have been straightforward. Wounded handler and wounded dog, transported together as established protocol dictated. The intervention that separated them in Germany represented more than a bureaucratic decision. It was the severing of a connection that had been forged through extraordinary circumstances and mutual sacrifice, a bond that defied conventional understanding and continued to resonate across a decade of forced silence. March 2013 arrived with unforgiving fury in the Korangal Valley. The mission had seemed straightforward on paper. Intelligence had identified a high-value target operating from a compound in one of the most contested regions of Afghanistan. Michael's unit, with Shadow leading the infiltration team, was tasked with confirming the intelligence and securing the location until extraction could be arranged. They had completed similar operations dozens of times before, moving with the practiced efficiency that had made them legendary among special operations groups. The first warning came from Shadow, a subtle change in his posture that Michael recognized instantly. Standard operating procedure called for an immediate halt and reassessment, but the narrow mountain pass left them exposed with limited options for cover. Michael signaled to the team to increase their pace, trusting Shadow's senses. Over the mission briefing that had assured them the route was secure, they were 300 meters from their objective when the world erupted around them. Later reports would confirm it was a sophisticated ambush. Multiple IEDs daisy-chained together with a secondary trigger system that bypassed conventional countermeasures. The first explosion hit their point position, creating momentary chaos as the team scrambled for cover amid automatic weapons fire from concealed positions in the cliffs above. Shadow reacted with the speed and precision that had saved their lives. Countless times before, dragging Michael toward a shallow depression seconds before a second explosion tore through their previous position. The official after-action report documented the sequence with clinical detachment. MWD 7789S alerted to secondary explosive device, removing handler from kill zone prior to detonation. What the report couldn't capture was Shadow's unflinching determination as shrapnel tore into his own body while shielding Michael from the worst of the blast. As the firefight intensified, Michael assessed their situation through a haze of pain and adrenaline. 3 of his team were wounded, their communication equipment damaged, and their planned extraction point now compromised. Shadow, despite bleeding from multiple wounds, remained operational, helping Michael establish a defensive perimeter as he called in their situation on the backup radio. The recording of that transmission preserved the grim reality of their circumstances. Sierra Actual, this is Nomad 6. We are taking heavy fire, multiple casualties, requesting immediate air support and medical evacuation at alternative LZ3. Be advised, we have confirmed enemy positions on ridge lines Alpha and Charlie. What happened next unfolded with brutal efficiency. Apache helicopters arrived to suppress enemy fire, creating a window for the medical evacuation team to reach their position. Medics worked frantically to stabilize the wounded, while Michael maintained tactical awareness, Shadow still performing his duties despite his injuries. The medevac prioritization followed standard procedure. The most severely wounded first. Michael, with a traumatic leg injury and significant blood loss, was among the critical cases loaded onto the first helicopter. It was during this chaotic extraction that the protocols faltered. Military working dogs typically remain with their handlers during medical evacuation when both are injured, a practice based on both practical considerations and the recognition of the crucial bond. Shadow should have been loaded alongside Michael, but as documented by Staff Sergeant Wilson, who witnessed the separation, Medevac was under heavy fire during boarding. Captain Sullivan was unconscious from blood loss when loaded. His MWD attempted to follow, but was restrained by Corporal Jenkins, who had received orders to hold the dog for the second extraction due to space constraints and triage priorities. The second helicopter never reached their position. Deteriorating weather conditions, combined with intensified enemy fire, forced an abort after taking multiple hits. The remaining team, including Shadow, was forced to withdraw to a secondary position until another extraction could be attempted 12 hours later. By then, Michael was in surgery at the field hospital in Bagram, unaware that Shadow had been separated from him and evacuated through a different medical channel. When Michael regained consciousness 3 days later in the military hospital in Landstuhl, Germany, his first questions were about Shadow. The medical staff had no information. Handler and dog had entered different evacuation and treatment systems. His commanding officer, Colonel Blackwood, assured him that Shadow was receiving veterinary care and would be reunited with him once both had stabilized. This was the beginning of what Michael would later describe as a wall of well-meaning lies that obscured the truth about Shadow's fate. As Michael underwent surgeries to save his leg, attempts that ultimately failed, resulting in amputation below the knee, Shadow was indeed receiving specialized veterinary treatment at the Canine Medical Facility. Military records obtained years later through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that Shadow had sustained significant injuries, shrapnel wounds to his left flank, a bullet graze across his shoulder, and trauma to his right hind leg. The veterinary assessment noted, subject demonstrates remarkable recovery capabilities and response to treatment. Despite severity of injuries, prognosis for return to operational status estimated at 70–85% with appropriate rehabilitation. The critical decision point came 27 days after the separation. Michael, now stabilized, but facing months of recovery and rehabilitation, formally requested Shadow's transfer to the Military Working Dog Rehabilitation Center at Fort Belvoir, where they could recover together, a request supported by documentation from both his medical team and Shadow's veterinary staff, citing the therapeutic benefits of maintained handler-canine connection during rehabilitation. This request triggered a sequence of bureaucratic responses that would permanently alter both their lives. The first communication came from the Office of Special Capabilities, a department within the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency that Michael had never encountered during his years of service. Their memorandum, marked for limited distribution, stated, MWD 7789S has demonstrated exceptional cognitive and performance capabilities that warrant specialized application. Subject has been temporarily reassigned under Directive SC 7736 for evaluation and potential inclusion in the Advanced Canine Operations Program. When Michael appealed this decision through his chain of command, the responses became increasingly opaque. His division commander received a classified directive indicating that Shadow's case had been elevated beyond standard military working dog protocols due to his unique operational profile and demonstrated exceptional capabilities. The language was deliberately vague, offering no specific information about where Shadow had been transferred or what the Advanced Canine Operations Program entailed. As Michael's physical recovery progressed, his battle to locate Shadow intensified. He filed formal requests through military channels, enlisted the help of his commanding officers, and even reached out to congressional representatives with oversight of military affairs. The responses formed a pattern that became maddeningly familiar. Acknowledgements of his service and sacrifice, followed by variations of, the information requested is classified under national security protocols, or the asset in question has been reassigned under special directive. The psychological impact of this separation compounded Michael's physical trauma. His rehabilitation therapist noted, patient demonstrates appropriate progress in physical therapy, but exhibits increasing signs of psychological distress related to the unresolved status of his military working dog. Recommend psychiatric evaluation and potential intervention to address complicated grief response. Dr. Lawrence Chen, the military psychiatrist who evaluated Michael, recognized the unique nature of the situation. Captain Sullivan's bond with MWD-7789S represents a specialized variant of the handler-service animal relationship, intensified by their shared combat experiences and mutual life-saving interventions. The abrupt termination of this connection without closure or explanation has created a persistent, traumatic response that conventional PTSD treatment protocols are inadequately addressing. 6 months into his recovery, as Michael was preparing for medical retirement from active duty, he received what appeared to be a breakthrough, a letter from Brigadier General Harris, overseeing the working dog program, stating that Shadow was adapting well to his new assignment and had successfully completed rehabilitation. The letter included a single photograph showing Shadow in what appeared to be a training facility, his physical recovery evident, but his new handler's faces obscured for security reasons. This communication, intended to provide reassurance, instead deepened Michael's determination to understand what had happened. The transition to civilian life brought new challenges. Michael's medical retirement, after 20 years of distinguished service, should have been a time of recognition and support. Instead, it became defined by his increasingly isolated quest to reclaim Shadow. The military support systems that had been central to his identity gradually withdrew as his persistence in questioning Shadow's reassignment created institutional discomfort. Former colleagues, while sympathetic, advised him to move on and focus on rebuilding civilian life. The impact on Tyler, then only 5 years old, was particularly profound. The boy had formed a deep attachment to Shadow during their limited time together, enhanced by the stories and photographs Michael shared during deployments. Tyler's understanding of his father's injury and career change was inextricably linked to the unexplained absence of Shadow. Child psychologist Dr. Marissa Jimenez, who worked with Tyler during this transition, noted, "Subject demonstrates age-inappropriate preoccupation with concepts of loss and return manifested through repetitive play scenarios involving rescue and reunion. Drawings consistently feature the missing service dog as a central figure, suggesting unresolved emotional processing of the separation." As months turned to years, the bureaucratic obstacles multiplied rather than diminishing. Freedom of information. ACT requests were denied under national security exemptions. Inquiries through veterans advocacy groups reached administrative dead ends. Even Colonel Blackwood, now working within the Veterans Affairs system and sympathetic to Michael's quest, encountered classified barriers when attempting to trace Shadow's reassignment through official channels. In the empty spaces where answers should have been, theories and rumors flourished. A former handler in Michael's support group mentioned hearing about a classified program developing enhanced canine assets for specialized operations. A veterans advocate suggested Shadow might have been redirected to diplomatic security details that utilized experienced military working dogs. A conspiracy-minded member of their unit was convinced the exceptional abilities Shadow had demonstrated had led to his inclusion in classified research programs studying advanced animal cognition. Without confirmation or denial, these possibilities haunted Michael's attempts to rebuild his life. The painful irony wasn't lost on him. The same governmental systems he had served with unwavering loyalty for 2 decades now treated his search for answers as an inconvenience at best and a security concern at worst. The wall of bureaucratic silence stood in stark contrast to the clear communication and trust that had defined his partnership with Shadow in the chaos of combat. The changes in the Sullivan household began subtly, like shadows lengthening as the sun descends, almost imperceptible until darkness has fully arrived. In the 18 months following Michael's medical retirement and the continued absence of Shadow, a profound transformation took hold of their lives, affecting every aspect of their daily existence and long-term well-being. Michael's physical recovery had progressed remarkably well, according to his medical team. The prosthetic fitting was successful, and his adaptation to the device exceeded expectations, a testament to his exceptional physical conditioning and determination. Dr. Amanda Reeves, his rehabilitation specialist, documented his progress. With clinical precision, patient demonstrates advanced proficiency with prosthetic device, achieving mobility metrics that place him in the top percentile for combat amputees. Physical milestones have been met or exceeded across all evaluated categories. Yet beneath this apparent success, more concerning patterns emerged. The same medical records noted increasing cancellations of follow-up appointments. Michael's participation in the recommended adaptive sports program became sporadic before ceasing entirely. The physical therapy journal he had been instructed to maintain showed decreasing entries, eventually containing nothing but the minimal required information. The psychological assessment presented an even more troubling picture. Dr. Chen's notes, from their increasingly infrequent sessions, revealed a man retreating from the world. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of isolation behavior consistent with unresolved trauma. While intellectually acknowledging the need for social reintegration, subject demonstrates active resistance to community engagement opportunities. Conversations consistently return to the unresolved status of his military working dog, suggesting an arrested grief process that is impeding normal psychological recovery. This deterioration manifested most visibly in the transformation of their home environment. The Sullivan residence, once meticulously maintained like the military quarters Michael had inhabited for 2 decades, began showing signs of neglect. Neighbors who had initially reached out with support gradually withdrew as their offers of assistance were consistently declined. The precision and order that had defined Michael's military life gave way to a grinding minimalism, functional but devoid of warmth, maintaining only what was necessary for basic survival and Tyler's needs. The impact on 7-year-old Tyler was impossible to ignore. His first-grade teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Patel, registered her concerns in a series of documentation that traced the child's changing behavior. Tyler was initially a participative and engaged student, eager to share stories about his father's military service and their dog Shadow. Over the past semester, he has become increasingly withdrawn during class activities. His artwork, previously colorful and varied, now consistently features dark colors and repetitive themes of searching or waiting. School records documented a troubling academic slide. Tyler's reading scores, initially above grade level, plateaued and then declined. His participation in group activities diminished, and incidents of emotional outbursts increased, particularly when other children discussed their pets or when military service was mentioned during patriotic school events. The school counselor's assessment noted, subject appears to be mirroring father's emotional withdrawal. When asked directly about family activities, Tyler consistently references when Shadow comes home as a future event that will restore normal family functioning. The routines they had established during Michael's recovery, once structured around healing and forward progress, gradually transformed into empty rituals that served only to mark time. The wall calendar in their kitchen, previously filled with rehabilitation appointments, school events, and community activities, grew increasingly empty except for the monthly notation S-file request, marking Michael's persistent Freedom of Information Act submissions regarding Shadow. Perhaps most telling was the transformation of the physical spaces meant for Shadow. The dog run in the backyard, initially maintained in perfect readiness for his anticipated return, began to show signs of neglect. Unfilled holes, unrepaired fencing, fallen leaves uncleared as seasons passed. Yet in stark contrast, Shadow's service equipment remained in immaculate condition. Michael cleaned and maintained the specialized gear weekly, a ritual that Dr. Chen identified as symbolic behavior indicating inability to process the permanence of the loss. The void left by Shadow's absence created ripple effects throughout. Their support system, Andrea's parents, who had been actively involved in Tyler's life following their daughter's death, expressed growing concern about Michael's parenting capacity. Their visits, once welcomed as family support, became sources of tension as they questioned the household's declining condition and Michael's persistent focus on locating Shadow rather than rebuilding their lives. Their concerns culminated in a difficult conversation documented in Michael's therapy notes, patient reports, confrontational interaction with in-laws regarding his parenting priorities. When they suggested he was clinging to the past at the expense of Tyler's future, patient terminated the visit and has since restricted their access to Tyler, further reducing the child support network. Even relationships within the military community, which should have provided understanding and support, began to fracture. Michael's participation in the local veterans support group became increasingly problematic, as documented by facilitator Mark Jennings. Sullivan's contributions have shifted from constructive sharing to persistent questioning about classified military programs and conspiracy theories regarding government appropriation of service animals. His intensity on this single topic has created discomfort among other members, several of whom have expressed reluctance to attend when he is present. Financial stability, which should have been secured through Michael's military pension and disability benefits, became endangered by his single-minded pursuit. Bank records showed increasing expenditures for private investigators, legal consultations, and specialized FOIA attorneys. Investments that yielded no tangible results, but steadily eroded their financial security. By the third year after his retirement, the college fund established for Tyler had been significantly depleted, redirected to finance the search for Shadow. The psychological toll manifested in Michael's deteriorating physical health. Despite his exceptional recovery from the amputation, new medical issues emerged that his doctors linked directly to chronic stress and sleep deprivation. His primary care physician, Dr. Samantha Torres, documented, "Patient presents with hypertension, persistent insomnia, and symptoms consistent with adrenal fatigue." When presented with the correlation between these conditions and his psychological state, subject acknowledges awareness but demonstrates minimal motivation to modify behavior patterns, contributing to decline. The most heartbreaking aspect of their decline was captured in Tyler's therapy sessions with child psychologist Dr. Jimenez. Using directed play therapy, she documented how the child had constructed an elaborate fantasy around Shadow's eventual return. Subject has developed a complex narrative wherein the missing service dog is engaged in a secret mission and will return to fix the family. This rescue fantasy serves as a psychological coping mechanism, allowing him to maintain hope in the face of his father's continued withdrawal and the deterioration of their home environment. Through art therapy, Tyler produced dozens of drawings that tracked the progression of his emotional state. The earliest pieces showed his father, himself, and Shadow together in colorful settings. As months passed, the drawings became increasingly monochromatic, with Shadow often depicted as a distant figure separated from them by various barriers, mountains, oceans, and eventually what Tyler described as government buildings. The perspective in these images shifted significantly, with Tyler and his father growing smaller, while Shadow and the obstacles between them dominated the composition. By the 4th anniversary of Shadow's separation, the Sullivan home had become what one concerned teacher described as a shrine to absence. Photos of Shadow covered the walls. Case files occupied the dining table that rarely hosted meals, and maps marked with potential facility locations replaced family activities. Michael's pursuit had transformed from a legitimate quest for answers into what his military-appointed psychiatrist reluctantly classified as obsessive behavior with delusional characteristics. The breaking point came during Tyler's parent-teacher conference in 3rd grade. Ms. Abigail Collins, who had worked with military families for over 15 years, documented her observations with compassionate directness. While Mr. Sullivan demonstrates clear love for his son, there appears to be a fundamental disconnect between his perception of their family situation and the reality of Tyler's developmental needs. When discussing Tyler's concerning withdrawal and academic regression, Mr. Sullivan repeatedly redirected the conversation to how these issues would resolve when we find Shadow. His inability to address current parenting challenges without referencing this future event suggests a level of functional impairment requiring intervention. This assessment triggered a series of evaluations that placed the Sullivan family at a crossroads. Child Protective Services, while finding no evidence of neglect warranting removal, recommended mandatory family therapy and parenting support services. The Veterans Affairs Mental Health Division flagged Michael's case for elevated intervention, assigning Dr. Elaine Matthews as his dedicated psychologist with a treatment plan focused on reintegration to present reality and development of functional coping mechanisms beyond recovery of the service animal. It was Dr. Matthews who finally broke through the protective walls Michael had constructed. During their 3rd session, she presented him with Tyler's school records, psychological evaluations, and a portfolio of his increasingly troubling artwork. Her approach, documented in session notes, confronted the harsh reality he had been avoiding. "I understand Shadow was more than a military working dog to you. What I need you to understand is that your son is becoming a casualty of this unresolved loss. Tyler is creating his entire identity around a rescue fantasy because he's lost not one, but 2 parents, his mother to cancer and now his father to this obsessive search." For the first time since Shadow's disappearance, Michael faced the full consequences of his fixation. The recognition that he was failing his son in the present while chasing ghosts from the past created what Dr. Matthews described as a moment of clarity amidst the fog of traumatic preoccupation. This painful awakening began a gradual, difficult process of psychological rebalancing, not abandoning the search for Shadow, but recalibrating its place in their lives to make room for healing and present-focused development. The Sullivan family stood at the threshold of either continued decline or painful recovery, their future hanging in the balance as Michael confronted the impossible task of honoring both his bond with Shadow and his responsibility to the son who needed him in the present. The path forward would require him to integrate the painful reality that Shadow might never return without surrendering completely to despair, a challenge as formidable as any he had faced on the battlefield, but one he would need to overcome. Not for himself, but for Tyler. At the Advanced Canine Research and Development Facility in Bethesda, Maryland, Shadow's journey took a direction radically different from anything Michael could have imagined. Officially designated as a classified installation operating under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the concrete and glass structure sat hidden behind layers of security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. Here, Shadow, now designated Sentinel in all official documentation, began his new life separated from the handler who had been his constant companion through war and peace. The transition proved more challenging than the facility's behavioral specialists had anticipated. Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez, the lead researcher for canine cognition, documented Shadow's initial response in her classified behavioral assessment. Subject demonstrates unprecedented resistance to standard reassignment protocols. Despite exemplary physical recovery from combat injuries, MWD 7789S exhibits consistent stress markers when separated from familiar handlers. Recommended adjustment period has been extended indefinitely as conventional retraining methods prove ineffective. The first 3 months established a pattern that would persist throughout Shadow's time at the facility. During training exercises, he performed with technical perfection, his intelligence and abilities confirming why he had been selected for the program. Yet psychological evaluations revealed a dog in constant search mode, what the staff termed handler-seeking behavior, that manifested even during the most advanced training scenarios. Security footage captured Shadow systematically checking entrance points whenever new personnel entered the facility, his behavior indicating he was actively searching for Michael. Dr. Rodriguez's notes from this period revealed growing concern. Subject maintains dual awareness during all activities, performing required tasks while simultaneously monitoring surroundings for specific human markers consistent with former handler. This divided attention, rather than diminishing with time as expected, appears to be developing into a systematic search methodology that suggests higher cognitive mapping than previously documented in canine subjects. The facility's objective for Shadow had been clear from the beginning. The Advanced Canine Enhancement Initiative sought to study exceptional military working dogs, identifying the neurological and behavioral factors that separated the extraordinary from the merely excellent. Shadow's unparalleled combat record and documented cognitive abilities made him an ideal research subject. The program's ultimate goal: to develop training protocols that could reproduce these exceptional qualities in future military working. Dogs depended on detailed study of outliers like Shadow. 6 months into his reassignment, the research team made a critical discovery. Dr. Marcus Chen, the neurologist assigned to Shadow's case, identified unusual patterns during cognitive mapping tests. Subject demonstrates neural activity consistent with complex memory formation and retrieval during problem-solving tasks. Most significantly, when presented with scenarios resembling combat environments, brain scans show simultaneous activation in regions associated with emotional memory and tactical assessment, a combination we've never observed in previous subjects. This finding accelerated Shadow's integration into the program's core research. The facility director authorized expanded testing protocols, moving beyond standard military working dog assessments to experimental scenarios designed to measure the limits of canine cognitive adaptation. Through these tests, a remarkable picture emerged of Shadow's exceptional qualities. Technical specialist Amelia Wright documented one particularly noteworthy session. During the multi-stage problem-solving assessment, subject not only navigated the primary challenge as expected, but appeared to recognize the underlying pattern of the test itself. After completing the third variation, Shadow began anticipating the next configuration before it was presented, suggesting metacognitive awareness previously undocumented in canine subjects. Despite these professional breakthroughs, Shadow's personal adjustment remained problematic. The facility's standard housing arrangements proved unsuitable as he displayed increasing signs of stress in isolated kenneling. After multiple incidents where he damaged kennel infrastructure in apparent escape attempts, Dr. Rodriguez authorized an unorthodox accommodation modification. Shadow was relocated to her office, where his stress markers immediately decreased to manageable levels. This arrangement, while against protocol, produced measurable improvements in both his physical health and test performance. In her private research notes, later obtained through congressional oversight, Dr. Rodriguez acknowledged the ethical complexity of their work. We are studying an animal with emotional capabilities far beyond our previous understanding of canine cognition. The bond with his former handler wasn't merely operational conditioning, it appears to represent a form of cross-species attachment that challenges our fundamental assumptions about animal cognition and emotional development. The turning point in Shadow's adjustment came through an unexpected channel. Major David Harrison, a wounded veteran participating in an unrelated therapy program at the adjoining medical center, encountered Shadow during a cross-facility exercise. Recognizing the dog's specialized training, Harrison requested permission to work with Shadow during his own rehabilitation. The facility's medical director, seeing potential research benefits, approved the interaction despite security protocol concerns. Their first session revealed something remarkable. Harrison, whose combat trauma mirrored Michael's in many ways, created a familiar context that visibly changed Shadow's demeanor. The facility's monitoring systems recorded a significant reduction in Shadow's stress markers during their interaction. Dr. Rodriguez's observation notes captured the significance. Subject appears to be generalizing his handler support behaviors to another combat-injured veteran, suggesting the possibility that his exceptional abilities may be transferable within specific contextual parameters. This discovery led to Shadow's gradual integration into the facility's Veteran Therapeutic Support Program, a dual-purpose assignment that allowed continued research while providing rehabilitation support to wounded warriors. Shadow's interactions with these veterans revealed capabilities that extended far beyond his formal military training. Captain Lisa Okafor, the occupational therapist overseeing the program, documented numerous instances where Shadow demonstrated apparent awareness of psychological distress before clinical signs were visible. During Group Session 17, subject alerted to participant C experiencing elevated anxiety approximately 3 minutes before physiological markers registered on monitoring equipment. Intervention positioning and pressure application appeared deliberately calibrated to participants' specific needs, despite no formal training in this therapeutic technique. As Shadow's role expanded, patterns emerged that provided insight into his exceptional nature. With veterans experiencing physical rehabilitation challenges similar to Michael's combat injuries, Shadow displayed targeted supportive behaviors, bracing techniques, mobility assistance, and retrieval adaptations that had never been formally trained. With those suffering from psychological trauma, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to interrupt negative thought patterns through precisely timed interventions. The research team gradually recognized that what made Shadow exceptional wasn't simply superior training or intelligence, but a form of adaptive empathy that allowed him to recognize and respond to human needs across a spectrum of presentations. This realization shifted the research focus from replication of his abilities to understanding the underlying cognitive processes that enabled them. Dr. Rodriguez's third-year assessment summarized this evolution. Subject has forced a fundamental reconsideration of our research objectives. The qualities that make MWD 7789S exceptional appear inextricably linked to his emotional development and social intelligence. His abilities aren't merely technical skills to be isolated and reproduced, but emerge from a complex integration of cognitive capabilities that developed through his partnership with Captain Sullivan. Throughout this period, Shadow maintained certain behaviors that the staff came to recognize as his continued connection to his former life. He consistently oriented himself toward the facility's western exit, the direction of Colorado where Michael and Tyler lived. Though the staff had no way of knowing the significance of this behavior, during thunder or training exercises involving explosive sounds, he would position himself in a protective stance facing the door, a behavior the veterans recognized as his attempt to shield an absent handler. Most tellingly, Shadow developed a routine during the facility's power-down periods. Security footage captured him systematically moving to each new resident's quarters, briefly investigating before moving on. Dr. Martin James, the night shift supervisor, eventually recognized the pattern. Subject appears to be conducting a methodical search of all facility areas accessible to him, with particular focus on newcomers. This behavior is consistent with trained search protocols, but self-initiated and focused on human identification. By the 4th year of his reassignment, Shadow had become an integral part of the facility's therapy program while continuing to provide valuable research data. His daily schedule balanced structured research assessments with therapeutic support sessions for veterans with complex trauma. The dual role provided structure and purpose that improved his overall adjustment, though the research team continued to document what they termed his continued divided attention, the part of Shadow that never stopped looking for Michael. The most significant development came in Shadow's 5th year at the facility. Dr. Rodriguez had been advocating for an expanded role that would allow Shadow to work with a wider range of veterans, including those transitioning to civilian life. After presenting extensive data on the therapeutic benefits observed, She received conditional approval for a limited community integration program. Under this new protocol, Shadow began accompanying select veterans to community reintegration, activities under careful supervision. These outings to shopping centers, parks, and eventually sporting events were ostensibly designed to support veterans struggling with civilian transitions. What the research team hadn't anticipated was how these expanded environments would affect Shadow himself. On his third community outing at a Veterans Appreciation event at a local baseball stadium, Shadow encountered a child approximately Tyler's age wearing an Army Ranger's cap. His reaction, documented by the supervising handler, demonstrated the persistence of his memory. Subject, abruptly alerted, focused entirely on the child and attempted to approach before being redirected. For several minutes afterward, he displayed scanning behavior consistent with search operations, checking surrounding crowd with methodical precision. This incident triggered a reassessment of Shadow's community integration activities. Security. Protocols were enhanced, and his public appearances became more limited and controlled. The research team recognized that despite years of reassignment, Shadow maintained a connection to his past that could be triggered by environmental cues, a realization that both complicated their research objectives and raised new questions about the ethical implications of their work. As Shadow entered his 6th year at the facility, now nearly 8 years separated from Michael, the research program itself faced a transition. Congressional budget reviews highlighted the significant resources dedicated to the Advanced Canine Enhancement Initiative, with questions about practical applications and ethical oversight. An external review committee was established to evaluate the program's methods and outcomes. This scrutiny created an unexpected opening. The review committee, which included civilian experts in animal cognition and welfare, raised specific concerns about Shadow's long-term psychological well-being. Their preliminary report noted, Subject MWD 7789S demonstrates exceptional capabilities that have contributed significantly to therapeutic outcomes for program participants. However, persistent behavioral indicators suggest ongoing psychological stress associated with handler separation. Ethical considerations mandate exploration of alternative placement options that better address subjects' demonstrated needs. This recommendation, buried in hundreds of pages of technical evaluation, created the first crack in the classified barrier surrounding Shadow's reassignment, a development that would eventually create the possibility of his path crossing with Michael's again after nearly a decade of separation. The journey that had taken him from battlefield to research facility had transformed Shadow from a military asset into something the research team had never anticipated. A pioneer forcing a reconsideration of how we understand the depths of canine cognition and the ethical obligations that such understanding creates. On a frigid February morning in 2023, the Veterans Memorial Park in Denver was transformed for the annual Winter Heroes Festival, an event honoring service members and first responders with a particular focus on working dogs and their handlers. The unseasonable snowstorm had threatened to diminish attendance, but the dedicated crowd of military families, veterans and supporters created a vibrant atmosphere despite the biting cold. Among the scheduled demonstrations was the Veterans Affairs' new PTSD service dog program, showcasing the remarkable results of their therapeutic canine initiative. The program had gained national attention for its innovative approach, pairing specially trained dogs with veterans suffering from combat-related trauma. The highlight of their presentation would be a public demonstration by their most successful team, a German Shepherd with exceptional capabilities, and the Army veteran whose life had been transformed through their partnership. Dr. Eleanor Matthews stood near the demonstration area, reviewing her notes for the introduction she would give as the program's director. The VA had invested heavily in expanding therapeutic canine services, and today's demonstration represented a critical opportunity to secure continued funding from attending government officials and private donors. As head of the Fort Carson program, she had personally supervised the integration of their star canine, now called Sentinel, with various veterans, documenting remarkable therapeutic outcomes that exceeded all projected metrics. "Are we still on schedule with this weather?" asked Representative Douglas Chen, the congressional representative whose support for veterans' mental health initiatives had been instrumental in launching the program. His presence at the event underscored the political significance of the demonstration. "Absolutely, Congressman," Dr. Matthews assured him. "Major Wilson and Sentinel have worked in far worse conditions than this. If anything, the environment adds authenticity. Many of our veterans face their most significant psychological challenges during weather that triggers combat memories." Across the park, unaware of the demonstration about to take place, Michael Sullivan navigated the festival grounds with his son Tyler. Their attendance hadn't been planned, a last-minute decision when Tyler's scout troop decided to volunteer. At the event's community service booth, Dr. Elaine Matthews, Michael's psychologist, had encouraged the outing as part of their ongoing work to build positive community experiences, not centered around their search for Shadow. The past 3 years had marked a gradual, painful process of healing for the Sullivan family. Michael's work with Dr. Matthews had slowly shifted his perspective from single-minded pursuit to a more balanced approach, maintaining hope for Shadow's return while rebuilding their lives in the present. Tyler, now 14, had shown remarkable resilience, his academic performance improving steadily as their home environment stabilized. "Dad, they're going to do a working dog demonstration over at the main stage," Tyler said, pointing to the schedule board. "Can we watch before heading to the scout booth?" Michael hesitated. These demonstrations still triggered complex emotions, but he recognized the importance of supporting Tyler's interests. "Sure, buddy. We've got time before your shift starts." As they made their way toward the main exhibition area, the festival announcer's voice echoed across the grounds. "Ladies and gentlemen, please gather at the Central Pavilion for a special demonstration from the Veterans Affairs PTSD Service Dog Program, featuring Major Robert Wilson and his service dog Sentinel, demonstrating advanced therapeutic techniques that are changing lives across our veteran community." In the preparation area behind the stage, Major Wilson performed final equipment checks, while Sentinel sat at attention, the German Shepherd's bearing reflecting his military background despite his current therapeutic role. The dogs focused. Discipline was precisely what had made him such an exceptional candidate for the program. The ability to maintain operational awareness while providing sophisticated emotional support to his assigned veteran. "You two ready for your big moment?" Dr. Eleanor Matthews asked, approaching with their introduction notes. "Ready as we'll ever be," Major Wilson replied, adjusting Sentinel's service vest. "Though he seems a bit distracted today. Probably the crowd and weather," Dr. Matthews observed the German Shepherd with professional interest. Despite nearly 3 years in the program, Sentinel occasionally displayed what their behavioral specialists called environmental scanning, a heightened awareness of surroundings that went beyond standard service dog alertness. Today, this behavior seemed particularly pronounced as the dog's attention repeatedly shifted toward the gathering audience. "Just follow the demonstration protocol we practiced," she advised. The congressional delegation is particularly interested in the anxiety interruption sequence and the nightmare response scenario. As the audience assembled, Michael and Tyler found positions near the back of the crowd. Michael intentionally maintained distance from these events, the sight of military working dogs still producing a painful mixture of pride and loss even after all these years. He focused on Tyler's excitement, using his son's positive engagement as an anchor for his own emotional regulation, as Dr. Matthews had taught him. The demonstration began with Dr. Eleanor Matthews addressing the crowd. Distinguished guests, veterans and supporters, today we're showcasing how specially trained service dogs are transforming treatment for combat-related PTSD. The bond between handler and dog creates a therapeutic partnership that medication and traditional therapy alone cannot achieve. She continued with statistical evidence of the program's success before introducing the demonstration team. Major Robert Wilson served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Army's 10th Mountain Division before a roadside bomb left him with both physical injuries and severe post-traumatic stress. For 2 years, traditional treatments produced limited improvement. That changed when he was paired with Sentinel, a former military working dog with exceptional capabilities that make him uniquely suited for therapeutic support. As Major Wilson and Sentinel walked onto the stage, a palpable shift rippled through the audience. The German Shepherd moved with unmistakable military precision despite his service dog vest, his bearing communicating both alertness and controlled power. Even to untrained observers, this was clearly no ordinary therapy animal. The demonstration proceeded through basic obedience exercises before transitioning to specialized PTSD support scenarios. Major Wilson narrated each sequence, explaining how Sentinel had been trained to recognize physiological changes indicating anxiety escalation or flashback onset, and to intervene with specific responses tailored to his needs. When Sentinel detects elevated stress markers, changes in breathing, heart rate, or subtle body language, he initiates contact with precisely calibrated pressure, Wilson explained, as the dog demonstrated a gentle but insistent lean against his leg. This grounding technique interrupts the escalation cycle before a full panic response develops. In the back of the audience, Michael watched with professional appreciation. As a former handler, he recognized the exceptional training and intelligence on display, yet something about the dog's movement pattern triggered an odd sense of recognition. Not specific memories, but a feeling of familiarity he couldn't place. The demonstration reached its most compelling sequence as Major Wilson simulated a nightmare response scenario. Seated on a bench, he enacted the beginning stages of a night terror while explaining to the audience. Many combat veterans experience severe nightmares that traditional medications cannot safely address without compromising daytime functioning. Sentinel is trained to recognize these episodes and respond with a specialized intervention sequence. As Wilson mimicked troubled sleep, Sentinel executed a remarkable series of actions, first applying gentle pressure with his head, then gradually increasing physical contact until positioned partially across Wilson's body in a specifically calibrated, deep pressure technique. The audience murmured appreciatively at the obvious sophistication of the response. This weighted intervention has reduced my nightmare episodes by 78% over 18 months, Wilson explained as he returned to standing position. Before Sentinel, I hadn't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in over 2 years, during the subsequent demonstration of hypervigilance interruption techniques. Something unexpected occurred. As Sentinel performed a perimeter check intended to demonstrate how he creates a psychological safety buffer in public spaces, his pattern suddenly changed. The German Shepherd's head lifted, ears shifting forward in a posture of intense focus. Directed toward the audience, Major Wilson, noticing the deviation, attempted to redirect with a subtle hand signal. For the first time in 3 years of partnership, Sentinel did not respond to the command. Instead, his attention remained fixed on something or someone in the crowd. Dr. Eleanor Matthews recognized the anomaly immediately. In hundreds of public demonstrations, Sentinel had never broken protocol. She moved toward the stage, prepared to intervene if necessary, when she observed something even more unusual. The German Shepherd's tail, typically maintained in the neutral position required for service work, began a subtle side-to-side motion. Not the full wag of excitement, but the controlled acknowledgement that experienced handlers would recognize as recognition. In the audience, an inexplicable wave of emotion washed over Michael. Something about the dog's current posture, head slightly tilted, weight shifted forward, that particular quality of focused attention, triggered a cascade of memories. Before conscious thought could intervene, he found himself taking a step forward. "Dad?" Tyler questioned, noticing his father's sudden tension. In that moment, several things happened simultaneously. Sentinel's behavior shifted from disciplined attention to unmistakable recognition. With a sound that was neither bark nor whine, but something uniquely between, a vocalization Major Wilson had never heard from him, the German Shepherd moved decisively toward the edge of the stage, all training protocols momentarily suspended. Michael's hand instinctively moved to his mouth, producing a silent whistle pattern. 2 short, 1 long, a unique signal he had developed with Shadow years ago for situations requiring absolute silence during operations. It was an unconscious gesture, the muscle memory activated by a connection his conscious mind still couldn't fully process. The reaction was electric. Sentinel froze, his entire body vibrating with attention, then executed a perfect tactical sitting position, not the service dog response he had been demonstrating moments before, but the combat-ready posture of an elite military working dog awaiting further command. The specialized signal, never documented in any training manual, never shared with any other handler, created a moment of absolute clarity that cut through. 10 years of separation and uncertainty. Recognition bloomed simultaneously for both man and dog as the impossible became undeniable. Shadow. Michael's voice barely carried beyond those standing nearest him, but the dog's reaction removed all doubt. With a precision that defied his years, the German Shepherd launched into motion, not toward his assigned handler on stage, but directly toward Michael, navigating through the crowd with single-minded determination. The audience, not understanding, The significance of what was unfolding parted instinctively as Major Wilson called out, "Sentinel, halt!" The command, which had never failed to stop the dog instantly, had no effect. Dr. Eleanor Matthews stepped forward, her clinical detachment momentarily forgotten as she witnessed what appeared to be a serious protocol breach in their star therapy. Dog, as Shadow reached Michael, he didn't jump or bark as a pet might after long separation. Instead, he executed the exact alert pattern they had used hundreds of times in combat. A silent, precise indication that transformed possibility into certainty. This wasn't just a German Shepherd with similar markings or behaviors. This was Shadow, responding to communication cues that only he and Michael had shared. "It's really him," Michael whispered, kneeling despite his prosthetic leg. "Tyler, it's Shadow." The boy, who had grown up surrounded by stories and photographs of the dog he barely remembered, stood frozen in shock. The German Shepherd, maintaining his disciplined bearing despite the obvious emotion vibrating through him, turned to acknowledge Tyler with the same head tilt captured in the photographs that had lined their walls for a decade. As festival security and program staff converged on the scene, the public demonstration transformed into something entirely unexpected. The catalyst moment that would finally bring together two journeys that had run parallel for 10 long years. Separated by classified programs, bureaucratic barriers, and the simple human failure to recognize the depth of connection between a handler and his military working dog. The Veterans Memorial Park demonstration dissolved into controlled chaos as security personnel formed a perimeter around Michael, Tyler, and Shadow. The crowd's confusion was palpable. What had begun as a routine service dog presentation had transformed into something no one quite understood except the man and dog at the center of it all. Major Wilson stood at the edge of the stage, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and concern as he watched his therapy partner of 3 years respond to a stranger with unmistakable recognition. Dr. Eleanor Matthews moved swiftly through the security cordon, clinical assessment overriding her initial shock. "Sir, I need you to step back from the animal immediately," she instructed, her voice carrying the authority of her position. "This is a certified service dog assigned to our PTSD program." Michael remained kneeling beside Shadow, his hand resting on the dog's shoulder in a handler's position that felt as natural as breathing. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is Shadow, MWD 7789S. He was my military working dog for 4 years through 3 combat deployments. We were separated after being wounded in Afghanistan in 2013. "That's not possible," Dr. Matthews replied, though uncertainty flickered across her features. "This dog has been with our program for nearly 3 years. His designation is Sentinel, previously assigned to the Advanced Canine Research Program. We have complete documentation of his service history." Security Director Paul Ramirez approached with 2 officers, his hand resting near his radio. "Dr. Matthews, do you want us to remove this individual?" Before she could respond, Colonel James Blackwood pushed through the gathering crowd, his military bearing unmistakable despite his civilian clothes. "Hold your position, Director Ramirez. I can verify Captain Sullivan's identity and his prior relationship with this animal." The unexpected intervention momentarily froze the confrontation. Blackwood's position as regional VA director carried sufficient authority to prevent immediate escalation, creating a small window for assessment rather than enforcement. He turned to Michael with the measured calm of a veteran commander. Sullivan, are you absolutely certain this is Shadow? Michael nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Sir, he just responded to a tactical command pattern we developed during our second deployment, never documented in any training manual, never shared with any other handler. He has the exact scar pattern from injuries sustained during the Korangal Valley operation. This is Shadow. The certainty in Michael's voice created visible discomfort among the VA staff. Major Wilson had descended from the stage and now stood observing Shadow's behavior with professional assessment. Dr. Matthews, I've worked with this dog for 3 years, and I've never seen him respond to anyone like this. Something's definitely happening here that we don't understand. Dr. Matthews hesitated, clinical training warring with bureaucratic responsibility. Even if what you're saying has merit, Captain Sullivan, this animal is currently federal property assigned to a VA therapeutic program. There are protocols and jurisdictions that can't simply be overridden based on emotional claims. With respect, Doctor, that's exactly what needs investigation, Colonel Blackwood interjected. If Captain Sullivan's identification is correct, we need to understand how a decorated military working dog went from combat injury to your program without his handler's knowledge, despite years of formal inquiries. The confrontation had drawn the attention of Representative Chen, who approached with his aide taking careful notes. Colonel Blackwood, what exactly is happening here? This disruption is undermining an important program demonstration. Blackwood turned to the congressman with measured respect. Sir, we appear to have a situation involving a military working dog that may have been improperly reassigned without handler notification. Captain Sullivan has been searching for this dog for 10 years through official channels, all of which apparently failed to connect him with an animal that ended up in a VA program under your committee's jurisdiction. Chen's political instincts registered the potential implications immediately. That's a serious allegation. We need to move this discussion somewhere more private. He turned to his aide. Contact my office and have them pull all authorization documentation for the canine assets in this program. As the initial confrontation stabilized into tense negotiation, security established a privacy perimeter, moving the central figures to the festival's administrative building. Shadow remained pressed against Michael's leg, maintaining physical contact while continuing to scan their surroundings with professional assessment. The dual awareness that had been noted throughout his time in the program, now revealing its true nature as the vigilance of a dog protecting his handler. Inside the festival administrator's office, the bureaucratic battle lines quickly formed. Dr. Eleanor Matthews placed a call to the VA Central Office requesting emergency consultation with the department's legal team. Security Director Ramirez positioned officers at the door, making it clear that Shadow would not leave the premises without official authorization. Major Wilson, visibly uncomfortable with the situation, maintained a professional distance while observing Shadow's continued attachment to Michael with evident confusion. I've been this dog's handler for 3 years, Wilson said quietly to Colonel Blackwood. We've lived together, worked together through some of my darkest moments. I've never seen him respond to anyone else like this, not even close. It's like watching someone flip a switch I didn't know existed. Blackwood nodded with understanding. Military working dog partnerships aren't like civilian relationships, Major. These dogs aren't just trained, they're bonded at a level most people never experience. What you're witnessing is the reactivation of a connection that apparently survived 10 years of separation. The administrative standoff escalated when Howard Jenkins, the VA's regional legal counsel, arrived 30 minutes later. His assessment of the situation was immediately adversarial. Captain Sullivan has no current legal claim to this animal. The dog was properly reassigned following medical rehabilitation when Captain Sullivan was incapacitated. All protocols were followed according to military working dog regulations. Michael's response carried the weight of a decade of frustration. I filed official inquiries through every possible channel for 10 years. I was repeatedly told there was no information available about Shadow's location or status. Now, he suddenly appears in a public VA program. That doesn't indicate proper protocol. It suggests deliberate obfuscation. Jenkins dismissed this with bureaucratic certainty. Your inquiries would have been processed through appropriate channels. If you received no information, that was because the information was properly classified under national security guidelines. Tyler, who had remained silent throughout the initial confrontation, finally spoke. If everything was done properly, why did no one ever tell my dad that Shadow was alive and working with veterans? We thought he might be dead all this time. The teenager's question cut through the administrative jargon, momentarily silencing the room. Dr. Matthews, whose clinical training made her more sensitive to the human dimension of the situation, turned to Jenkins with evident discomfort. Howard, the boy has a point. When Sentinel, or Shadow, came to our program, there was no information about a handler seeking reunification. That seems like a significant oversight. The arrival of Representative Chen's senior aide with preliminary documentation added another layer to the unfolding bureaucratic labyrinth. Congressman Chen has requested an immediate review of all transfer documentation for this animal. Our preliminary search indicates discrepancies between Department of Defense records and VA acquisition documentation. Jenkins immediately objected. Those records fall under classified protocols. The Congressman's office doesn't have authorization to access that information without proper clearance and formal committee procedures. Actually, Mr. Jenkins, the aide replied with professional precision, Representative Chen sits on both the Veterans Affairs Oversight Committee and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. He has direct supervisory authority over both the program that currently holds this animal and the funding mechanisms that supported its transfer between departments. This unexpected political dimension shifted the power balance in the room. Jenkins looked visibly unsettled as he consulted his tablet, searching for bureaucratic procedures that could maintain departmental control over the situation. Even with appropriate committee authority, there are interdepartmental protocols that must be observed. This animal was transferred from a classified research program before entering the Therapeutic Service Division. Colonel Blackwood seized on this admission. So you're confirming that this dog was part of a classified research program after his combat service? That directly contradicts the information Captain Sullivan received when inquiring about his military working dog status. The tension in the room was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez, who had been remotely monitoring the situation since being notified by Dr. Matthews. As Shadow's former research supervisor at the Advanced Canine Research and Development Facility, her presence added a crucial missing perspective. Shadow's reaction to her arrival was subtle but immediate. Recognition without the emotional connection he displayed with Michael. I can confirm this is MWD 7789S, formerly partnered with Captain Sullivan, she stated directly, bypassing the administrative posturing. I supervised his transition from military working dog to research subject and subsequently recommended his transfer to the therapeutic program when it became clear his exceptional abilities were better suited to veteran support than continued research. Her directness momentarily silenced the bureaucratic arguments. Michael looked at her with a mixture of anger and desperate hope for answers. You knew about our connection. You knew I was searching for him. Dr. Rodriguez met his gaze with professional composure. I knew you had been his handler, Captain Sullivan. What I didn't know until reviewing his complete file was that you had been actively searching for him. That information was compartmentalized. My clearance gave me access to his military service record, but not to the FOIA requests or congressional inquiries you had submitted. That's bureaucratic nonsense, Michael replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Someone had to process those requests. Someone made the decision to keep us separated. You're correct, she acknowledged, surprising everyone with her candor. And identifying that decision chain is precisely why I'm here. When I learned about today's incident, I pulled Shadow's complete file using my research security clearance. What I found suggests deliberate administrative interference, rather than standard classified protocols. This statement visibly alarmed Jenkins, who immediately attempted to redirect the conversation. Dr. Rodriguez, you're not authorized to discuss potential security breaches in this setting. We need to move this entire situation to a secure facility. Due for proper review. That won't be necessary, Mr. Jenkins, came a new voice from the doorway. Major General Robert Harkins, recently appointed to oversee military working dog programs across all branches, entered with the quiet authority that came from 4 decades of distinguished service. I've reviewed the preliminary information and authorized an immediate suspension of classified restrictions on MWD 7789S's file. His arrival transformed the bureaucratic battlefield, introducing command authority that transcended departmental silos. Captain Sullivan, it appears your inquiries were indeed received and properly logged, but subsequently misdirected through what I can only characterize as deliberate administrative interference. The question we're now investigating is whether this represents individual misconduct or systematic failure. General Harkins turned to address all parties with decisive clarity. Until this situation is fully investigated, I'm implementing the following interim protocols. MWD 7789S will remain under VA supervision, but with immediate authorized contact between Captain Sullivan, his son, and the animal. Dr. Rodriguez will oversee a complete medical and psychological assessment to determine the impact of renewed contact. All documentation from DoD, the research program, and the VA Therapeutic Division will be consolidated for review by a joint oversight committee. This military intervention provided temporary structure to a situation threatening to collapse under conflicting jurisdictions, but it left the fundamental question unresolved, whether Shadow would return to the Sullivan family or remain in the VA program where he had been providing vital service to veterans like Major Wilson. The bureaucratic battle lines had been drawn, with Shadow caught between competing claims of ownership, therapeutic necessity, and the undeniable bond that had survived a decade of institutional separation. As the meeting adjourned with temporary protocols established, Michael finally had a moment alone with Colonel Blackwood. Sir, they're still treating him like equipment to be assigned and reassigned. After 10 years, after everything we've been through, they still don't understand what they took from us. Blackwood nodded, the weight of decades in military service evident in his expression. The system isn't designed to recognize the bond you had, Sullivan. It's built on protocols and classifications, not relationships. But that dog remembering you after 10 years, that's something they can't classify or regulate away. That's real, and now everyone in that room knows it. That's where we start. As they prepared to leave the administrative building, Shadow maintained his position beside Michael, his behavior reflecting both his military training and the renewed connection with his original handler. The German Shepherd's divided existence, Sentinel, the therapy dog, and Shadow, the combat veteran, had suddenly converged in a bureaucratic battlefield where the outcome remained uncertain. But the truth of their bond had become impossible too. Deny.News of the dramatic reunion at the Winter Heroes Festival spread through military and veteran communities with astonishing speed. What began as confused social media posts from festival attendees evolved into a coherent narrative as journalists pieced together the remarkable story of a handler and military working dog reunited after 10 years of separation. The viral video, captured by a teenager's shaky smartphone, showed the unmistakable moment when Shadow recognized Michael. His disciplined military bearing momentarily giving way to pure recognition that transcended his years of specialized retraining. Within 48 hours, the story had transcended local interest to become a national conversation about military working dogs, the bonds formed in combat, and the bureaucratic systems that had kept them apart. Veteran groups across the country, recognizing the profound significance of the situation, began mobilizing support through established networks built on shared service and sacrifice. In the conference room of the Silver Creek VFW Post 7209, Master Sergeant Dwayne Washington addressed the standing room-only gathering of veterans, active duty personnel, and family members. The retired Special Forces operator had served alongside Michael and Shadow during their second deployment and understood better than most the significance of their partnership. This isn't just about one handler and his dog, Washington explained, gesturing toward the mission board where Shadow and Michael's service details were displayed alongside the complex timeline of their separation. This is about the sacred promise we make to those who serve alongside us, that we leave no one behind. Shadow wasn't equipment to be repurposed. He was a brother-in-arms who saved countless lives, including many in this room. The mobilization took shape with military precision. Veterans from multiple service eras organized into specialized teams focused on different aspects of the campaign. Vietnam veterans with decades of experience navigating VA bureaucracy formed the administrative core, developing a strategic approach to the complex jurisdictional issues. Younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan deployments managed digital outreach, creating coordinated social media campaigns that rapidly expanded public awareness without descending into sensationalism. Retired Marine Colonel Diana Espinoza, now a prominent civil rights attorney specializing in military cases, assembled a legal team drawing from veterans in the legal profession across 5 states. The Sullivan case presents unique challenges that cross multiple jurisdictions, she explained during their first strategy session. We're dealing with military property regulations, service animal classification, veteran healthcare protocols, and research program oversight, all intersecting around what is fundamentally a case about recognizing the human-animal bond in military service. Her legal analysis identified the critical weakness in the government's position. The systematic failure to respond to Captain Sullivan's inquiries over a 10-year period demonstrates either gross administrative negligence or deliberate obfuscation. Either scenario creates significant liability exposure that relevant agencies will be motivated to resolve rather than litigate in the public eye. The community mobilization extended far beyond traditional veteran organizations. Canine handler associations from police departments, search and rescue teams, and service dog training programs recognized the broader implications for their own fields. Tracy Mendoza, director of the Rocky Mountain Search and Rescue Dog Association, organized a coalition of professional handlers to provide expert testimony about the unique nature of working dog partnerships. What we're seeing in Shadow's case is the persistence of the handler bond across a decade of separation and institutional interference. Mendoza explained to journalists at a press conference attended by dozens of handlers with their working dogs. This directly contradicts the government's classification of military working dogs as equipment that can be reassigned without consideration of existing bonds. The research data alone from this case will transform how we understand canine cognition and attachment. The mobilization's most powerful dimension emerged through the involvement of wounded warriors who had benefited from service dog programs. Veterans suffering from PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and physical disabilities who had experienced the life-changing support of service animals understood both sides of the equation, the therapeutic value Shadow provided in the VA program, and the profound significance of his bond with Michael. Former Army Specialist Gabriela Torres, who had received a service dog through the same VA program that had utilized Shadow, testified at a Veterans Affairs Committee hearing hastily convened. To address the situation, my service dog Ranger saved my life when medication and therapy couldn't reach me. I understand the vital importance of these programs, but I also know that if someone separated me from Ranger after everything we've been through together, it would be nothing short of cruelty, no matter how noble the purpose. What happened to Captain Sullivan and Shadow was wrong, and fixing it doesn't mean dismantling the programs that help us. It means making them more humane. As community support expanded, practical logistics emerged as a crucial focus. The Sullivan family's modest resources couldn't sustain a prolonged legal battle against government agencies with seemingly unlimited capacity for bureaucratic resistance. Veterans groups across Colorado organized fundraising efforts that quickly expanded nationwide, creating a legal defense and family support fund that grew exponentially as the story reached broader audiences. Senior Master Sergeant Amir Khan, who had served as a military working dog program manager before his retirement, coordinated specialized support focusing on Shadow's potential transition needs. If we succeed in reuniting them permanently, Shadow will need specific support to reintegrate into family life after years in institutional settings. We're assembling a team of canine behaviorists, veterinarians, and handlers who understand the unique challenges of this transition. This practical support extended to the Sullivan family's home environment. A team of veterans with construction experience volunteered to adapt their residence with features that would accommodate Shadow's age, and previous injuries while supporting his continued service as Michael's assistance dog. The modifications, specialized ramps, dedicated rehabilitation spaces, and secure perimeter features were designed to create an environment that honored Shadow's military background while supporting his new civilian role. Religious communities joined the mobilization, recognizing the moral dimensions of the case. Chaplain Marcus Rodriguez, who had served with the unit adjacent to Michael and Shadows during their final deployment, organized an interfaith prayer vigil that drew hundreds of participants from diverse spiritual traditions. This reunion reminds us that bonds of loyalty and service transcend human limitations, Rodriguez told the gathered supporters. When we witness such profound connection, surviving against impossible odds, we're reminded of the sacred nature of the promises we make to those who serve alongside us. The community activation's effectiveness became evident when political attention shifted. Representative Chen initially focused primarily on the programmatic implications for his committee's oversight responsibilities, recognized the broader significance as constituent communications flooded his office. The bipartisan nature of the support, veterans and service dog advocates spanning the political spectrum, created rare common ground in an otherwise divided political landscape. Chen's Chief of Staff, Victoria Hammond, acknowledged this reality. During a strategy meeting with VA officials, the optics of fighting this reunion are politically untenable. We're receiving more constituent contact on this issue than we saw during the healthcare debate. The veteran community has unified around this case in ways that transcend typical advocacy patterns. The most unexpected dimension of the community, mobilization, came through the scientific and research communities. Dr. Elizabeth Winters, a renowned expert in canine cognition, assembled a coalition of researchers who petitioned for access to Shadow's complete testing and performance data from his years in the research program and therapeutic service. This case represents an unprecedented opportunity to understand the persistence of cognitive emotional bonds in working dogs, her petition stated. The documented recognition behaviors after 10 years of separation suggest neural mechanisms we've only begun to understand. Requiring Shadow to remain in institutional settings rather than with his original handler not only raises ethical concerns, but potentially squanders a remarkable research opportunity. This scientific perspective provided crucial support for the legal team's core argument that Shadow's return to the Sullivan family served multiple interests rather than forcing a choice between private reunion and public benefit. Attorney Jason Martinez, a former JAG officer now working with Colonel Espinosa's legal team, focused on this integration in their formal petition. Shadow's demonstrated capabilities can continue benefiting veterans and research initiatives through a cooperative arrangement that acknowledges the primary importance of his bond with Captain Sullivan while facilitating continued therapeutic service under appropriate protocols. Through coordinated effort, the coalition secured a crucial procedural victory when the Department of Defense Inspector General's office announced a formal investigation into the handling of Captain Sullivan's inquiries over the 10-year separation period. This administrative review, while separate from the custody determination, created significant leverage by explicitly acknowledging potential misconduct in the original separation and subsequent information management. Major Wilson, Shadow's handler, in the VA program, provided unexpected support that proved instrumental in shifting institutional perspectives. Despite his own profound connection with the dog he had known as Sentinel, Wilson's first-hand observation of Shadow's immediate and unmistakable recognition of Michael led him to advocate for reunification. His testimony before the VA review panel carried particular weight. For 3 years, I've worked with this dog daily, lived with him, depended on him during my darkest moments. We formed a strong working bond that helped me rebuild my life. But what I witnessed at that festival was something entirely different, a level of recognition and connection I've never seen before, even with handlers who've worked with their dogs for decades. Wilson's statement continued with painful honesty. It would be devastating to lose Sentinel's support in my ongoing recovery. But continuing to separate him from Captain Sullivan, now that we know the truth, would contradict everything the therapeutic program stands for. We're supposed to be healing psychological wounds, not perpetuating them by keeping this dog institutionalized when his handler has been searching for him for a decade. The community mobilization reached its most visible expression 6 weeks after the reunion, when over 3,000 veterans, service dog handlers, and supporters gathered for a demonstration outside the Department of Veterans Affairs headquarters. In Washington, D.C., the disciplined, silent formation, handlers and dogs standing at attention in precise rows, created powerful imagery that dominated news coverage and social media. Their message, displayed on simple standardized signs, cut through political noise with military clarity: no handler left behind. This public pressure coincided with the release of preliminary findings from the Inspector General's investigation, which identified systematic failure to properly process and route handler inquiries regarding MWD 7789S, including documentation that Michael's congressional inquiries had been repeatedly misdirected, despite containing identifying information that should have connected him with Shadow's reassignment. The report specifically noted the probability of these repeated routing failures occurring through standard administrative error is statistically negligible, suggesting deliberate interference in the proper processing of these inquiries. The investigation implicated Howard Jenkins, the VA Regional Counsel, who had initially opposed Michael's claim, revealing that he had previously served in the Judge Advocate General's office, overseeing the very department that had processed Michael's early inquiries. This connection suggested potential personal involvement in the original administrative obstruction, a revelation that transformed the narrative from bureaucratic failure to potential misconduct requiring accountability. As pressure mounted from multiple directions, the institutional resistance began to fracture. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, recognizing both the merits of Michael's claim and the opportunity to strengthen rather than damage the therapeutic dog program, proposed a compromise that would become the foundation for resolution. Shadow can serve as a pioneer in a new cooperative model where formally paired military working dogs maintain their primary bond with their original handlers while participating in structured therapeutic service for other veterans. This approach honors existing bonds while expanding rather than diminishing the program's capacity to serve wounded warriors. The community mobilization had transformed a personal reunion into a movement for systemic change in how military working dogs are classified, managed, and transitioned at the end of their service. What began as Michael's solitary decade-long search had become a unified effort that transcended traditional boundaries between military and civilian advocacy creating new alliances that would continue advocating for recognition of the unique. Bonds formed between handlers and working dogs long after Shadow's individual case was resolved. The carefully negotiated interim arrangement allowing supervised visits between Michael, Tyler, and Shadow appeared to be working smoothly. 3 times weekly, they would meet at the VA facility where Shadow remained housed with Major Wilson, spending 2 hours in the specialized training yard designed for service dog acclimation. Dr. Eleanor Matthews observed these sessions with clinical detachment, documenting Shadow's behavior for the official assessment that would ultimately determine his permanent placement. During the 4th week of this arrangement, as legal teams and advocates continued their work behind the scenes, Shadow's behavior during a routine veterinary examination raised concerns. Dr. Garrett Phillips, the VA's chief veterinary surgeon, noticed unusual stiffness in the German Shepherd's right hind leg, the same leg that had been injured during the Korengal Valley explosion a decade earlier. "I'm seeing potential signs of degenerative joint disease," Dr. Phillips explained during the impromptu case conference that followed his examination. "The original shrapnel wounds appear to have caused more extensive damage than his previous medical records indicate. I'd like to perform a comprehensive orthopedic assessment including advanced imaging." 2 days later, as Michael and Tyler arrived for their scheduled visit, they were met by Dr. Matthews in the administrative office rather than the training yard. Her expression conveyed the seriousness of the situation before she spoke. "Captain Sullivan, we've identified some concerning medical issues with Shadow. Dr. Phillips is waiting to brief you on the findings." The veterinary surgical suite at the VA's specialized canine care unit reflected the program's substantial funding. Equipment matching the standards of advanced human medical facilities filled the sterile space. Dr. Phillips gestured toward the illuminated display showing Shadow's latest scans, his expression grave as he explained what they had discovered. "The MRI reveals extensive deterioration in Shadow's right hip joint and lower spine," he explained, pointing to the highlighted areas. "The original combat injuries created progressive damage that was masked by his exceptional pain tolerance and physical conditioning. More concerning is what we found here," he continued, indicating a mass visible near the spinal column. "This growth is pressing on his spinal cord. It appears to be a complication from retained shrapnel fragments that migrated over time." Michael stared at the images, military medical training from his years as a combat leader helping him grasp the severity even before Dr. Phillips delivered his assessment. "How bad is it?" "Without intervention, Shadow will experience progressive pain and eventual loss of mobility in his hindquarters," the veterinarian explained. "The spinal compression is particularly concerning. It could eventually cause neurological damage beyond the pain he's currently managing." Dr. Matthews, who had been observing Michael's reaction, added context to the situation. "We've consulted with specialists at Colorado State's Veterinary Teaching Hospital. They've identified a potential surgical intervention that could address both issues, but the procedure is complex with significant risks." "What kind of risks?" Michael asked, his focus entirely on Shadow's well-being rather than the broader custody implications. Dr. Phillips was direct in his response. "The spinal surgery carries approximately a 30% risk of complications that could affect mobility or pain management. Additionally, Shadow's age and the chronic nature of these injuries create elevated anesthesia risks The alternative is pain management and eventual mobility assistance, but with a significantly diminished quality of life and accelerated decline. Tyler, who had remained silent during the medical explanation, asked the question that cut through the clinical assessment. How much pain is he in right now? The veterinarian's expression softened as he addressed the teenager. That's actually what alerted us to the problem. Military working dogs, especially those with Shadow's background, are conditioned to conceal pain indicators that would be obvious in pet dogs. He's displaying subtle compensation behaviors that suggest significant chronic pain, but he continues, performing his duties without visible limitation. It's quite remarkable and concerning. Dr. Matthews guided the conversation toward the immediate decision point. The surgical team at CSU has an opening next Wednesday. Their lead orthopedic surgeon has extensive experience with military working dogs and has offered to take Shadow's case, but we need to make a determination quickly. What seemed like a straightforward medical decision was immediately complicated by the bureaucratic realities surrounding Shadow's status. Howard Jenkins, the VA counsel who had been implicated in the obstruction of Michael's previous inquiries, entered the consultation room with a folder of documents and a rigid expression that suggested conflict rather than cooperation. Before any medical decisions are made, we need to clarify jurisdictional authority, Jenkins stated, placing the documents on the conference table. Under current arrangements, major medical decisions for Sentinel remain under VA authority as outlined in the temporary custodial agreement. The proposed procedure exceeds standard veterinary care thresholds and requires departmental review before authorization. Michael's response was immediate and uncompromising. His name is Shadow, not Sentinel, and he needs surgery now, not after. Weeks of administrative review. Jenkins remained unmoved. The animal's designation in VA records is Sentinel. Regardless of what you called him during your service together, his current status is governed by department regulations. The surgical recommendation will be reviewed according to established protocols, which include assessment of cost-benefit factors considering the animal's age and service capacity. The implication was unmistakable. Shadow's medical treatment would be evaluated not purely on his well-being, but on his continued utility to the program. The bureaucratic language disguised a brutal calculus about investment in an aging service animal with potentially diminished future capabilities. Colonel Blackwood, who had been monitoring the situation closely since the reunion, recognized the dangerous inflection point. Mr. Jenkins, given the ongoing Inspector General's investigation into your previous involvement with Captain Sullivan's inquiries, your participation in this medical decision process represents a clear conflict of interest. I'm requesting your immediate recusal. The confrontation might have escalated further if not for the unexpected intervention of Representative Chen, who had arrived for a scheduled program review that coincided with the medical consultation. His legislative aide had briefed him on the developing situation, and his presence shifted the dynamic in the room. Mr. Jenkins, I find your position concerning, Chen stated with the measured precision of an experienced legislator. This committee has allocated substantial resources to this program precisely because it recognizes the inherent value of these animals beyond their utility metrics. If department regulations are being interpreted to delay necessary medical care based on productivity calculations, that represents a significant policy deviation requiring congressional review. This political dimension created temporary space for medical considerations to take precedence, but it didn't resolve the fundamental question of who held decision-making authority for Shadow's care. The standoff continued until Major Wilson arrived, having been notified of the crisis by Dr. Matthews. "With respect, sir," Wilson addressed Jenkins directly, "I'm Shadow's current handler of record within the program. If this is being framed as an operational decision rather than a medical necessity, then my assessment should carry primary weight. And I'm formally requesting immediate approval for the surgical intervention at CSU," Jenkins responded with bureaucratic precision. "Major Wilson, while your input is valuable, handler recommendations are subject to program director approval for interventions exceeding standard care parameters. Additionally, given the animal's age and the significant resources required for this procedure and subsequent rehabilitation, the cost-benefit analysis must consider potential placement outcomes pending resolution of the custody determination." The underlying message was clear. If Shadow might eventually be returned to Michael rather than remaining in the VA program, the department was reluctant to invest in expensive medical intervention. This calculating approach created a cruel paradox where Shadow's medical needs were caught between competing jurisdictional claims. Dr. Matthews, whose clinical focus remained on Shadow's well-being regardless of custody outcomes, attempted to redirect the conversation. The immediate medical necessity should take precedence over administrative considerations. "We have a surgical window at CSU that will close if we don't make a determination within 48 hours. Jenkins remained unmoved. The department has established protocols for these decisions that cannot be circumvented, regardless of timing constraints. If the CSU surgical team cannot accommodate our review timeline, we can pursue alternatives through in-network providers once approvals are secured." The tension in the room escalated as medical urgency collided with bureaucratic obstruction. Michael, who had maintained remarkable restraint throughout the confrontation, finally responded with the directness of a combat veteran. "This isn't about department protocols or resource allocation. This is about Shadow suffering while you use his pain as leverage in a custody dispute your office helped create by hiding him from me for 10 years. The accusation hung in the air, its truth too stark to dismiss, yet too damaging to acknowledge within the institutional framework. Before Jenkins could formulate a response, Dr. Phillips intervened with medical clarity that cut through the administrative. Posturing. Shadow's condition won't wait for committee reviews or jurisdictional disputes, the veterinarian stated, addressing everyone in the room. The spinal compression is already causing neurological symptoms that will worsen progressively. Delaying intervention significantly increases both surgical risks and the likelihood of permanent damage. This medical reality created an impossible situation. Shadow needed immediate care that neither side had uncontested authority to approve. The German Shepherd's welfare had become secondary to the institutional battle for control, with his suffering the collateral damage of bureaucratic warfare. The crisis point deepened when Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez arrived from the research facility. Having been notified of Shadow's medical situation through her continuing oversight role. Her presence added another layer of complexity to the already volatile situation, as her security clearance granted her access to Shadow's complete medical history, including details of his treatment immediately following the combat injuries, that neither the VA team nor Michael had been permitted to view. "There's something everyone here needs to understand," she stated, after reviewing Dr. Phillips' current findings and comparing them to her secured records. The spinal and hip deterioration we're seeing now was identified as a probable long-term outcome during Shadow's initial rehabilitation. The research program documented progressive changes consistent with what we're seeing now, but this information was classified under research protocols and never shared with the therapeutic program. When he was transferred, this revelation transformed the nature of the crisis. What had appeared to be a sudden medical emergency was revealed as the predictable progression of conditions that had been documented but deliberately withheld across departmental transfers. The knowledge that Shadow's suffering could have been prevented through earlier intervention or specialized management protocols created a new dimension of institutional failure.